Hey YouTube and students past and present and maybe even future. I have been recording a couple videos for my sort of essay process thing that I'm working on. If you watch step one, you know that I've been using this program called OBS, and it's been pretty good so far. I think the quality of the videos is, pretty solid. I think that the audio mixer thing is super cool. And there's a lot of other features that I hope to play with in the future. I think that I gotta turn down my computer volume a little here. We'll just try that. And you'll notice that it drops off on the audio mixer a little bit lower. I'm listening to some lo-fi hip-hop mix thing right here. But we just went through step one. We were talking about Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. And I kind of want to keep this theme going. So I'm going to actually go over here to step two in the process, which is this one, creating an introduction, right? So our introduction is very important to the essay process. We want our intro to be probably one of the most powerful parts of our paper. Because our intro is going to grab our reader's attention, number one, and number two, it's going to focus our paper for the future, right? So it's going to set us up for everything that we're going to do in the paper. Everything we do in the paper is going to relate back to our thesis statement and our introduction and the things that we sort of claim in our intro. Also, a well-written intro is going to give your reader such a good impression that I don't know how to say this, but if you screw up the rest of your paper, the intro will help to soften that blow, right? So it's our reader's first introduction to us as a writer, right? So if we did step one, we should have this stuff done right here. But it says, does your thesis clearly state your stance on the prompt and answer the question that it is asking? All right, so if we go back here, it's asking, based on your reading, what is the message by Poe to his audience through Masque of the Red Death, right? We answer that, we have a clear sort of answer to that, right? Here it says, does your thesis clearly outline your major talking points? Okay, it's step one. If we did this section, we have talking point one, or topic one, topic two, and topic three. So, and we have those things, we can incorporate those things into our thesis right here, right? It's all together. So when we go back, do you have literary devices and techniques in mind that you intend to discuss in the paper, right? If we go back to step one, we know that we're going to talk about imagery. We know we're going to talk about symbolism and metaphor. We know we're going to talk about characterization and metaphor with topic three, right? Now, if you ignore this part here, then you're going to be hurting later because you're going to have to do this work at some point in your paper, right? You really want to brainstorm these things beforehand so that you have a good idea of where your paper's going and what your major talking points are. That way you're thinking about it throughout. And when you get to your body paragraphs, it will be much easier to identify evidence and know what you're going to talk about with that evidence, right? So we have our things, right? If we go to step two, we've answered all of these questions. We can give a big thumbs up and say, yep, I've got that stuff ready, all right? Down below, it says if your answers are yes to all of these, check out the frames below. These are sentence frames for writing a thesis statement. It's just a way to spice up your thesis if you are struggling with it, or if you're not sure if your thesis really makes sense, you can ask yourself, does it fit into this frame? And if it does, then it's probably a fine thesis, right? So if we were to go through, our thesis was Edgar Allan Poe suggests that no one can escape death. This one, I'm going to copy that directly from step one, right? I'm going to move it over here to this box right here. Okay. Now I'm going to look at these sentence frames and see if any of them would be helpful for me, right? So it says in the short story, this would be The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The author suggests that my thesis, no one can escape death, and trying to is an endeavor in futility. This is evident in blank, blank, and blank. These are going to be my three topics, which I don't really mention here, so I'm going to have to do that. And it says ultimately this means people should do their best to help others and seize the moment to truly live life to its fullest. All right. So we do have that part. there are a few things from this frame here that I feel that I should incorporate in here. For example, the name of the text, right? So I could say in the Masque of the Red Death, Edgar Allan Poe suggests, actually I need to put a comma here because that's a dependent clause. In the Masque of the Red Death, Edgar Allan Poe suggests that no one can escape death, is an effort in futility, etc., etc., right? Now we want to add where we see this in the story, and this is going to be our topics from step 1. So we said Prospero's party, the symbol of the clock, and the character of Prospero, all right? So here we want to put those in the order that we want to talk about them. So we could say this is seen in the story through the revel, the symbol of the clock, and the character of Prospero. Okay, those are the 3 things that we're going to talk about. All right. I then say, if this is true, then people should do their best to help others and seize the moment to truly live life to its fullest. All right. Now I have a really solid thesis statement, right? I mentioned the text, I mentioned the author, I talk about my thesis, I talk about what this means in real life and how I see it in the story. Okay. So this is all going to become my kind of permanent running thesis. All right. Again, I use these sentence frames to kind of spice it up or to double check my work to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Because we wouldn't want to say Edgar Allan Poe suggests all of this without mentioning the story in our intro, because then our audience would not know really what we're talking about. Edgar Allan Poe has written many, many stories, right? For example, if I scroll down, these are the major steps that have to happen for a successful introduction, all right? So the first thing is you have to have a hook. You know, most of you guys know that. You know, they probably hammered that in middle school. And a hook is something that I find that a lot of students have anxiety over. They want to have a great hook, right? And ultimately, hooks are not something that matter all that much. Sorry if you're a middle school teacher and you disagree with me. But in the end, in the future, you know, you're not going to be trying to focus on that as much as your thesis probably. A hook can be something that's just, you know, related to your thesis. In fact, a hook should be related to your thesis. It shouldn't grab your audience's attention only to direct them to something radically different than your thesis. So if we're writing a essay about the inevitability of death, a hook could be as simple as something like seize the moment, right? Or one should try their best to help others because life is hard and will ultimately lead to death, or something like that. Then we want to give some context for our argument or some background, tell a little bit about the story, what's going on. In step 1, I talked about, you know, this is a story about a guy who is named Prince Prospero and he's trying to avoid this plague that's killing his people, right? We would want to talk about that so that our audience understands what's going on in the story. Then we want to narrow to our specific argument, all right? This is a step in the intro where students tend to struggle, but here I find that if you think about the prompt is going to give you an idea of what your specific argument is, right? And our prompt asks us to think about the message in the story, right? So we can talk about something more specific here, like the prompt, and that will get us to our narrowing down to what we want to say. Here, we're going to hit our thesis. Our plan of attack is going to be our 2 to 3 reasons that we want to talk about, and we've already generated that right here, okay? So step 4 and 5 of this part is basically done for us already, all right? It says, hints for this essay. Be sure to introduce the title of the stories and the authors at some point in your intro. So sometimes you're writing on one story, sometimes you're writing on multiple stories. At any rate, you want to always introduce the stories that you're going to talk about, the authors you're going to talk about. It says, introduce the reader to the issue at hand. What is the major conflict in the story? So this is going to come down to your sort of framing of what the problem is in the story. All right. State your thesis towards the end of your introduction. I find that a lot of students will immediately just do this, and they'll be like, that's my introduction. Now, it does accomplish most of what an introduction should do. I will know what your paper is about, but I won't know anything about the story, right? So I'll know the story itself. I'll know that it was written by Edgar Allan Poe. But if I haven't read it, I don't understand why you're telling me this information, right? I know that you want to prove that death is inevitable. I know very clearly what you're going to talk about. But I just have no idea what's up with this story, all right? So we want to go back. We want to complete these parts here, right? So number one, a hook. This is going to be a means of engaging your audience in the paper's statement about the story, all right? Why is this important? Could be something to think about. Could just be eye-catching but relevant to the story. There are a couple ways to accomplish a hook, right? I often tell my students to think about these things, right? You could list a interesting fact, probably not relevant to this paper, but maybe it is. A statistic is sometimes an interesting way to get the audience's attention. You can ask a question. And this one I actually tell students is very dangerous. If you ask a question that your audience can immediately answer and has no, struggle with, they're not going to want to read your paper, right? I often give bad examples of students, from middle school who are like, have you ever read a book? And if your audience has read a book, they're not going to want to read your paper, right? They're going to be like, this is dumb. So we don't want to ask obvious questions, right? But if we ask a deep question, something that is perhaps unanswerable, right? Like, what is the nature of death, right? No one has an answer to that question, right? No one's been able to, I guess, come back from the dead and report back and be like, hey, this is how this goes down once you die, right? So that might be an okay question. It's also related to the story that we're going to talk about, right? Now, you can also do this. You can just make a statement. In order to make a statement, I often think about what questions would I ask if I was going to ask a question, and then I just answer them, right? For this one, I would probably start by making a statement, something about death, right? So I'm just going to leave these up here just so that we have them as a reminder, but I'm going to say people should live life to its fullest, seize the day, something like that, carpe diem. Let's see. People should live in the moment and help others because life is suffering and inevitably we are all carrying a heavy burden. That's just a statement that's related to the story. It's kind of like Gandhi-esque, I guess. We're all carrying a heavy burden, so we should all try to help each other, right? Now, in the story, Prospero does the opposite, right? Like, his people are dying, he throws this party, and this gives me a good jumping off point to talk about the story, right? So, however, I'm going to transition here, and then I'm going to give some information about the story here, all right? So, however, in the story, by Edgar Allan Poe. However, in the story, The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, no comma here, actually. The author describes a very different situation. Okay, so I'm setting myself up to talk about what is the situation with Masque of the Red Death. All right, the story has a main character named Prospero. who is a prince of a country under siege by a plague called, quote, the Red Death. I'm just throwing quotation marks around it because that's the specific, thing that they call it in the story, right? I'm gonna put a period inside the quotation marks because that's grammatically how we do that. Now I need to know what the crux or the problem or the main issue of the story is, right? So that's what's going on. That's general or background information, right? This is the context of the story, right? Now the specific problem is that Prospero goes about this in a way that's kind of messed up, right? He throws this party to avoid the problem, and the problem eventually comes and kills him, all right? So here we want to talk about that main issue or that main problem or the specific issue or problem that's happening in the story that leads us to the message, all right? Here I'm going to say this ultimately becomes problematic in the text because Prospero the leader of the people decides to throw a party or masquerade, because it is a masquerade party, to avoid the plague, but the plague ends up killing Prospero by the end anyway. Okay, this sets us up to hit our thesis statement. All right, now I have a couple blue lines here. I want to reread this to make sure that this is correct. This ultimately, interjection here, commas on both sides, becomes problematic in the text because Prospero, interjection, the leader of the people, that's also an interjection, comma, decides to throw a party or masquerade to avoid the plague, but the plague ends up killing Prospero by the end anyway. Prospero and all of his people, actually. There we go. All right, so what we want to do is we want to hit our thesis, hit our reasoning, and then we're basically done with this part. So I'm going to back that up. And we want to give it a read through, all right? People should live in the moment and help others because life is suffering and inevitably we all are carrying a heavy burden. However, in the story The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, the author describes a very different situation. The story has a main character named Prospero who is a prince of a country under siege by a plague called the Red Death. This ultimately becomes problematic in the text because Prospero, the leader of the people, decides to throw a party or masquerade to avoid the plague, but the plague ends up killing Prospero and all of his people by the end anyway. The only thing that I would add is that he throws this party in an abbey where he walls himself in thinking that he's safe, right? And it's kind of ironic that he ends up being killed. It's also ironic that his name is Prospero, like prosperous, even though he's not prospering, right? This ultimately becomes problematic. Decides to throw a party or masquerade in a walled abbey. Let's put that there, okay? In the Masque of the Red Death, Edgar Allan Poe suggests, now we've already mentioned this, so we don't technically have to mention it again right here, but I like to have students put it in their thesis just in case they forget to mention it up top, because sometimes kids get rambly when they're doing story time or retelling the story, right? So I stylistically don't like to say it again, so I'm going to actually say in the story. And instead of saying Edgar Allan Poe, because we've already said that, I'm just going to use his last name, right? When we say introductory phrase like that or dependent clause like that, we have to put a comma. In the story, Poe suggests that no one can escape death, and trying to is an endeavor in futility, all right? This is seen in the story through the rebel, the symbol of the clock, the character of Prospero, and the character of Prospero. If this is true, then people should do their best to help others and seize the moment to truly live life to its fullest. This is echoing what I said in my hook. And if you notice, what the heck? Nope. If you notice, this puts a nice little tie, right? Like I preview up here what this is all about, and then I hit that really real moment down here, okay? The only thing I would do again here is I would go here and I'd hit 12, enter. It's gonna make it all 12-point font. This should be always Times New Roman or Arial to be MLA formatted correct, which I'm not seeing the option for here. It's kind of weird. First I'll make it all bold and then I'll make it unbolded. Should be here, but this is not correct. Normal text, apply, no. Options, nope. Here we go. I don't know why that was not showing before. All right, so highlight it. Times New Roman. Okay. I guess it made some changes to this, but yeah, that should be what it looks like in the end when you're done. All right, so that's my intro, okay? I have an example down here. This one is based on Richard Connell's story, The Most Dangerous Game, which most of our students have read in 9th grade. I taught this last year. So I just wrote this up, and students can look at this if they're struggling a little bit. But I've color-coded this to match this part right here. So you can look through that example if you need help with this, all right? This same process essentially applies to every paper, every intro that you'll write. You take your thesis, you frame your thesis by giving this sort of context, you get your audience's attention, and that's it for an introduction. And you might see using this process that once you've determined your thesis and how you're going to prove it, writing an introduction becomes so much easier, right? If you have all these things in mind, these other things naturally just come together, all right? Because you know what you're going to talk about, all right? I often tell students that if you know what you're going to talk about, if you have your thesis, you basically have your paper halfway done, right? And you can actually think about your thesis in your day-to-day life and actually be actively working on your paper even though you're not sitting in front of a computer. So if you just think about death being inevitable and what people should do if that's the case, and you think about the story, when you go to sit down in front of a word processing device, you know, like your computer, you won't just stare at a blank screen, which is something that I dealt with a lot in college, right? So I went to go write a paper and I had nothing to say. And the reason I had nothing to say is I hadn't really thought about it. So I like to, you know, encourage kids, just think about it, and you don't have to do any like quote unquote work, but you're actually getting a lot done. And it's really helpful, right, to do that. And then you don't have the anxiety of 3 hours before a paper's due just staring at a screen and freaking out, which I think a lot of kids do, right? So hopefully you found this video helpful. This is, again, step 2 of basically six steps that I have for this essay process. So if you like this, if you found it helpful, you know, subscribe, I guess. You'll get notifications, and then that way you can see anytime I post a new video or new content like that. Thanks again, as always, for watching.